Hi, everyone. This is Jason Barack of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a returning guest. He's Dominic Frisby of England. Let me give you a little bit of bio, and we want him to talk about his new book, Life After State. But Dominic is an actor, a comedian. He has the popular podcast Frisbees, Bulls, and Bears that's talked about natural resource investing. And he just released a book called Life After the State. So thank you that I really want to talk about, because I think our listeners should really take a look at the book, buy the book, because England was free market capitalism, and the United States used to have somewhat of free market capitalism. And I think that's the direction I think the United States is heading, unfortunately. So I'm just glad to have Dominic on to talk about his new book. Thanks for joining us, Dominic.
My pleasure, Jason, and thank you very much for having me. And I should say, on the kind of free market capitalism route, I reckon we're about 50 years ahead of you. And when I say ahead, I suppose I really mean behind, in that we've gone further down the road to the large state model than you have. But you're catching us up fast.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I actually just pulled up an article from the Telegraph. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the article, but it's the greatest 50 British inventions.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And I was looking at a lot of the inventions down here, and it's the steam engine. You guys were the first country to do the Industrial Revolution, I believe.
Yeah.
And you have a long list of great inventions, but almost all the inventions are really in the 17, 18, and early 1900s, and the innovation, all these great inventions basically stop before 1950.
Yeah, well, we did invent something fairly big not so long ago called the Internet, or the World Wide Web, which has had a fairly big impact. That was invented by a gentleman called Tim Berners-Lee, who actually comes from Wandsworth, where I used to live in southwest London. But you're absolutely right. I think they did some kind of study. I don't know how you evaluate this, but it came out with something like 50% of things that exist in the world were invented by, not the English, the British. And I think it's something like 25% by Americans. It's some incredibly disproportionate number, given what, a small island we were. But you're absolutely right. 50% of our GDP used to be manufacturing, and now it's something like 10%. And we used to invent and make a lot of stuff, and most of that stuff came when we, in the 18th and 19th centuries, when we basically, it was called classical liberalism, but it was basically a libertarian society. We had very small government and very unintrusive government, and we had independent money. We were on a gold standard, and people were left to get on with it.
Yeah, and you guys had low taxes, you had entrepreneurship, you didn't have a humongous bureaucracy as it was gaining. I think one of the main reasons why the spending just increased was so much was you guys started running a massive welfare warfare state prior to World War I, and then World War I and World War II just compounded the problem, and then that basically put you guys so far in the hole debt-wise that was basically it.
Yeah, I mean, there was no income tax until 1911. I think you had it in 1913, you brought it in, but 1911 we first had it, and it was for a tiny amount. We briefly had income tax during the Napoleonic Wars, but then it was disbanded.
It's very interesting. I did not know that, but it's just I'm sure it's not a coincidence that right around the time where the United States got the income tax, that you guys only a couple of years before also got the income tax.
Yeah.
Because there was just so much coordinated action there. The Federal Reserve was owned by a lot of, British families and things like that, besides the banking interests, that I'm sure they were coordinating their efforts.
In 1914, when we were on a gold standard, and when we went to war, nobody quite knew what we were doing. And but there was a big saying, that it was hoped that the war would be over by Christmas. The war began in August, and it was hoped it would be over by Christmas. And obviously it went on for 4 or 5 years. And I mean, I can't remember what the numbers are, but I think it was, if you include the Spanish flu that followed the war, it was the most devastating war in history in terms of the amount of people that were killed. And we came off the gold standard in order to print the money to pay for the war, and Germany and France did exactly the same thing. Now, if we'd stayed on the gold standard, there wasn't the money to pay for the war, so it would have had to end. And it was only made possible by the fact that we printed the money to pay for it. Now, if Germany had taken their, and so I mean, I first think that's an incredible thought that being on a gold standard could have stopped that war growing to anything like the extent that it did. But if we hadn't come off the gold standard and Germany did come off the gold standard, they would have won the war. Now, so that's when people talk about, the importance of money limiting government, they're absolutely right. But, I mean, as it happens, it probably might not have been such a disaster if Germany won the war. Maybe it would have been better for everyone involved if they had won the war and it had ended earlier. But, there is that other side of it to consider. Sometimes, if your government is protecting your country, I mean, Germany weren't invading the UK, but they were invading France, it slightly muddies the morals of that particular tale.
Well, that's a very interesting point. I'm not sure I really have the expertise to comment on that much, but I could just say, though, that when the economy is going bad, normally the first thing almost any government wants to do, and this is out of the playbook for many hundreds, if not thousands of years, is war.
Oh, yeah.
So the politicians, they don't want to take the blame for bad spending projects or too high taxes or misallocation of capital. They want to blame the evil, greedy speculators or the foreigners who shipped in exports, right, and destroyed the industry of their own country. And that's normally the drumbeats that eventually lead to war. I mean, most people don't even understand World War II. It's not taught in the textbooks, unfortunately, but the United States basically baited Japan in a lot of aspects into attacking Pearl Harbor. The United States put enormous tariffs on all Japanese imported goods, and Japan's largest market was the United States, I think.
Yeah.
And the U.S. also cut off, I believe, Japan has no natural resources. So at that time, the U.S. was the Saudi Arabia of oil. The U.S. was producing, I think, number 1 or number 2 most oil in the entire world at that time, and Japan had to import mass amounts of oil, and the U.S. just cut them off and said, tough luck.
Okay.
So, yeah, these countries, I mean, I'm not saying that what Japan did during the war wasn't bad. Japan and Germany did a lot of horrific things. But, I mean, these governments, a lot of them bait each other into wars, so they're playing the long game. I mean, the U.S. had been preparing for war for many years. The FDR had been preparing for war for many years. I think Churchill had wanted FDR to come into the World War II for many years prior to that before, and FDR had to come up with a plan to sell it to the American people.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Churchill had been trying to get FDR into it for a long time before Pearl Harbor. But that point you made then about governments liking wars to get them out of economic holes. I'm not sure that in this day and age that a war would be that popular anymore, despite, the kind of economic hole in which we find ourselves. In fact, I think it would be unpopular. I mean, they talked about going into Syria and it was kind of vetoed.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, the U.S. has already had a bunch of quote-unquote mini-wars where we've gone into Iraq and Afghanistan and, so many others. There was the one with Clinton where he put us in the into Europe there with Bosnia and those other the conflicts there.
In the Balkans, but that I mean, again, I don't know a great deal about the Balkans, but that seems to be one foreign intervention that might have actually worked. If there is such a thing.
Well, there was a lot of innocent women and children that were killed too. So I mean, like there's just a lot of collateral damage and a lot of other. But my point though was that there's a lot of military people here in the U.S. and even the military people, a lot of them are starting to secretly donate to Ron Paul and vote for Ron Paul, and it's like a dirty secret of the military that a lot of people are only in the military, unfortunately, Dominic, because of that's where they can only find a job. There's a lot of people from my home state of California that I went to high school with, and they haven't been able to find that good of work, and a lot of them have had to join the military in order to find a job in California.
Okay.
So, that's not really the topic that I wanted to talk to you about. I wanted to talk to you about your book.
Mm-hmm.
You have a very interesting first chapter about Cuba.
Yeah.
And just tell listeners a brief summary about the Cuban chapter, because I think it's very interesting about many decades of communism and socialism, what that ends up leading up to.
I went on holiday to Cuba when I was a young man. I think it was 95 or 96, and it was Cuba was it was just after things like, you probably remember the boat people, all those people who tried to flee Cuba to get to Florida and would sink on the way, and people were taking huge risks to leave the country, and it was incredibly poor then. And you went there, and Havana was an amazing city with amazing buildings in it. A lot of it built with alcohol money, gangsters' money in the 1920s and 30s. Money that had come from the illegal sale of alcohol in the US. And, because Cuba was where a lot of Americans would go to have fun way back when, before Castro took over. And so you had these amazing buildings, but at the same time, nobody had looked after them for years. So, the plaster would be falling off, or you'd go around a corner, there'd only be half a building there, and nobody had bothered to clear away the rubble or try and restore it or anything. So the whole city looked like it needed re-rendering. And at the same time, the only cars there in Havana were either those huge, great 1950s cars like the ones you used to see in Back to the Future and things like that, or they were laders imported from the Soviet Union in the 1970s. And so there was only these two cars, and there was this weird kind of contrast of the huge American opulence and the rather dour looking communist larders. And the official money of Cuba was the peso, the Cuban peso, and the official exchange rate was 1 peso to $1. But on the black market, you could get 20 pesos to $1 quite easily. Now, I was quite an intrepid explorer in those days. I went walking down the Mosquito Coast in Honduras and did all sorts of other quite adventurous things. And I told myself before I went, well, I'll get there and I'll just start using the local money. And, I'll get out of the dollar-based economy. Because everyone who'd been there said, you need dollars. And I always thought, well, I won't need dollars. I'll just get off the beaten track and into the real Cuba, and I'll just use Cuban pesos. But the reality is that there was nothing to buy with Cuban pesos. The only things I found that you could buy almost were these kind of weird pizzas from pizza stalls on the street and ice cream. For some reason, Cubans did quite nice ice cream. I don't know why that is. Anyway, probably because they produce a lot of sugar. But
It's warm down there too.
Sorry?
Ice cream always sells when it's hot out, right?
Yeah, that too. But anyway, but you couldn't, things like if you wanted a pair of jeans or meat or just, kind of stuff that we consider every day, you would have to go to one of these state supermarkets. And the bizarre thing was that in this state-run supermarket, the only currency they would accept is dollars. So Cubans were absolutely desperate to get dollars because it was the only way they could buy stuff. And as I say, the official exchange rate was 1 to 1. And you'd have like, I don't know, an engineer or a professor in the university or a doctor or something, and they'd be paid between 400 and 600 pesos a month. Now, by the time, if you divide 400 pesos, that would be $400 at the official rate. But if you divide it by 20, then it's just, what's 400 divided by 20? 50. So it's just $20 a month. 20. So you'd have a professor earning $20 a month, a highly educated individual. And yet a hooker could earn $20 or she could earn $100 or, many, many times that just for one night's work, as could a taxi driver or, somebody. So the only way Cubans could get dollars was by getting access in some way to a tourist and the tourist and the dollars that tourists brought with them. So you just had everyone wanted their kid to, everyone, all the women, all the young girls would become hookers, and the men would all try and be waiters or taxi drivers if they could somehow, if they were lucky enough to have access to a car. And you created this bizarre society where parents they didn't want their children to be, what we might consider a good thing, an industrialist or a doctor or an engineer. They all wanted their kids to be either waiters, taxi drivers, or hookers. And I remember it reached. I remember this being rammed home. I was staying with an economics professor for a little bit, and we were sat on this on the Malecon, which is this kind of embankment in front of the sea in Havana, and we were watching all the beautiful young girls all try and chat up the tourists and try and find themselves a boyfriend. And the economist described the whole thing, and he described this society that had resulted, where everyone wanted, and he said every Cuban father wants his daughter to be a hooker. And I remember that just stuck in my head, and I couldn't believe it. Now, I'm sure when Castro overthrew Batista and there was the Civil War, I'm sure there was, all sorts of political idealism. I'm sure he wanted to right some of the wrongs that had gone on in the Batista regime and all the rest of it. But was his aim to create a society? And then obviously he faced American sanctions, and so he fell in with the Soviet Union. You wonder if he was a genuine communist or he was just doing it out of political expediency, and all that stuff that went on. But was his aim to create a society in which every father wants his daughter to be a hooker? I doubt it very much.
Yeah. I doubt it. And actually, to add to your point there, I read Lee Iacocca, and he his autobiography, and he was the CEO of Chrysler, and he had designed some great cars, and he actually went down to Cuba on a vacation a number of years ago, and he actually got to sit down with Fidel Castro, and Fidel Castro was smoking, gave him Cuban cigars, and they had a long chat, and Fidel Castro was like, oh, I love your so-and-so model. You invented the Ford Mustang. That's my favorite car. I think maybe he had like that shipped in just for himself, but he was admitting that economically Cuba did go too far. He was like, socialism, communism, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
He was like, my country is so backwards. And to add further examples to that, you mentioned the $20 a month salary. I'm a baseball fan, and there's some amazing Cuban baseball players. Cuba's known as having some of the best baseball training programs in the entire world. These kids start playing baseball at age 2 or 3 or 4. As soon as they can walk, they put on a glove and a ball. And they have this guy named Jose Abreu. He's only like 26 or 27, and Yasiel Puig, he's about 24. These guys were only earning about $10 or $15 a month in American dollars in Cuba playing baseball. They did all kinds of crazy things to escape. They tried a number of times. Yasiel Puig's escape might be turned into a movie because he was held hostage and his life was threatened, and he was taken to Mexico and he was held for weeks barely without food and water. And these guys risked their lives on rafts and dealing with pirates and other criminals in order to come to the United States, where if they had lived in the United States, they would have been drafted, made millions of dollars as a young talented baseball prospect. And these guys are some of the best players in the major leagues now, but they go from earning $20 a month to now Jose Abreu got a $60 million contract right away.
My friend I have a French friend, and he used to be the leading promoter of salsa music in Europe. And so he was always getting bands over from Cuba to come and play in the South, in France or in Italy or in Spain, and sometimes in the UK. And every time he'd get a band, famous guys, and every time they'd go, oh, I've got a really big band this time, and I need this, and there'd be hundreds of people in these bands, dancers and, percussionists and goodness knows what. And they would all come, and they'd all get into Europe on the basis of, they were performing there, and they were, they were managed by things. And then half the time, half the band would just go missing.
They defected?
Yeah. They get here, and then as soon as they got in, under the guise of being, they just disappear.
I don't blame them at all, but I mean, it's got to be tough to start over. Maybe they made some phone calls, or maybe they did some bad deals with some dangerous people like loan sharks or something like that. Yasiel Puig in particular, some of the deals he had to make, I think he had to sign over 30% of all of his future life's earnings in order to get the smugglers to smuggle him out of Cuba and to hold him up in Mexico. And it's his life is eventually, his name's Yasiel Puig.
Yeah.
If you're familiar with baseball, his life story may eventually get turned into a movie, supposedly because of all the stuff. But ESPN did a documentary special on it for about half an hour or an hour. But in terms of the rest of your book, one of the main themes is rent seeking. So before you talk about your definition of rent seeking, I have Wikipedia up. Let me just read a definition from Wikipedia, and you can tell me what you think about that.
Okay.
When a company, organization, or individual uses their resource Investopedia, sorry, not Wikipedia. When a company, organization, or individual uses their resources to obtain an economic gain from others without reciprocating any benefits back to society through wealth creation. An example of rent-seeking is when a company lobbies the government for loan subsidies, grants, or tariff protection. These activities don't create any benefit for society. They just redistribute resources from the taxpayers to the special interest group.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good definition. There's quite a lot of words there. That's a pretty good definition. It's not the most readable definition that I've ever heard, but it's a pretty good definition. I mean, I like to think of if you make something, you bring some kind of, rather than a rent seeker is someone who, rather than make something new and create wealth that way, prefers to manipulate social systems in order to earn his living that way. So exactly, lobbying is an absolutely perfect example. Rather than, make glasses or iPhones or grow stuff or mine stuff or, produce something that's actually useful to people or write stuff, they just try and exploit the social systems as they are. By trying to get a grant or a subsidy or some. I mean, the worst offenders are people who try and get favourable legislation of some kind.
Yeah, I consider them parasites, and I don't know about your economy that much. I learned a lot about your economy from reading your book.
Yeah.
But here in the U.S., I live right outside of Washington, D.C., which is like the belly of the beast, and the culture of rent-seeking is pervasive. So from the lobbyists to the politicians are just as rent-seeking because they only care about they talk about talking points, oh, we care about the poor, or oh, we care about this and that. They really only care about staying in office and making as much money as they can on side deals and setting themselves up to be worth $10 million when they leave office. A lot of politicians, even low-level ones in Congress and House of Representatives, come into the House of Representatives worth less than a couple $100,000, and they leave even after one term being worth more than $5 million. And our culture of rent-seeking is not just through the lobbyists and politicians. It's pervasive in business schools. A lot of business teachers are teaching that if you're an entrepreneur, your main customer, you shouldn't mind if your main customer is the government and you sell all your stuff to the government.
Yeah.
And we have all these CEOs that are, looking to do financial engineering with the free-fed cheap dollars and low interest rates, and so they're making all these gains with the stock market where they do financial engineering. So they don't even have to invest in research and development, which is how you really grow a company, long-term value creation. So they just buy back their shares to make earnings look larger. It triggers all their stock options. They load the balance sheet of their company with debt, but they beat earnings. Yeah. So it triggers all their stock options, and they're out in 2 or 3 years making $20 million that they didn't really deserve.
Yeah, well, similar stuff goes on all the time. There was a big debate in the UK the other day between Nigel Farage, who's the head of the UK Independence Party, who want England out of the European Union, and Nick Clegg, who's the Deputy Prime Minister. And Nick Clegg was talking favourably about the EU and why we should be a part of it. And but you just watched it, and it's pretty obvious that Clegg it's fairly likely that Clegg's not going to have a job at the end of this Parliament. And his whole debate, and there was a big party political broadcast that he made all about it, and it was basically him advertising for a big fat juicy job in Europe after this election cycle is over.
Yeah, I mean, that's all these politicians, like, they pretend to care. Maybe there's a few exceptions where they actually do care about some sort of issue, and they'll stand pat like Ron Paul or Nigel Farage, and they won't budge. But then no one will do a deal with them. The lobbyists will hate them. And most people aren't willing to stand pat on their issue like that because they want to make other people happy. They want to put more money in their pocket. I'm sure they have a bunch of people, every day coming up to them and saying, if you do this and do that, I'll take care of you and I'll get you these, $250,000 consulting jobs like what Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan are getting now. I'm sure politicians get speech stuff like that. I know Bill Clinton makes over $500,000 for every single speech he gives, even if it's only a couple minutes.
Wow. Lot of wonga.
Now, you also mentioned in your book about the specific city, I forget the name, in Scotland, where the port city.
Glasgow.
Yeah, Glasgow. And this was a very prosperous city at low taxes. They were getting basically almost all the shipping through the English Empire, or a very large percentage of it was starting there from the manufacturing inland was going out of there. Do you think Detroit and Pittsburgh and Baltimore and some of these American cities, do you think they're headed down that path?
I think they're already there, aren't they?
Well, Detroit is, and Pittsburgh did have a disastrous, I think, in the 70s, and they had to clean things up. And Pittsburgh is finally starting to recover now. But I think there's a lot of American cities that are heading down that path. I know Baltimore, which actually Baltimore is a very good comparison for Glasgow. Baltimore used to be, most people don't know this, used to be one of the richest cities in the United States.
Yeah.
It used to have a humongous amount of the percentage of the total United States shipping, and they had low taxes, they had a very good middle class, a lot of high net worth people and industrialists there, and then the city just started spending money it didn't have, and the businesses just left.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid that's just what happens to former industrial cities when they no longer become competitive. It's an awful thing. I mean, Glasgow. I mean, it's amazing how rich Glasgow once was. It was regarded as the second city of the British Empire. It was the fourth richest city in Europe, and now it's like the heroin capital of the UK. People in Glasgow have a life expectancy of less than 2/3 of people in the rest of Britain. There's so much unemployment. It's multi-generational welfare dependency. It's a real mess.
It actually sounds exactly like Baltimore, because Baltimore had a very similar statistics, and Baltimore has a very high drug problem. Most of the people in Baltimore don't have jobs. Most of the people are getting a lot of welfare checks, and a lot of people game the system. So there's a lot of people that are signed up for 5 or 6 different welfare programs that they shouldn't be able to qualify for because they're only already on 1 or 2. So they figured out how to game the system that way, to hustle and buy drugs and, not get themselves out of the situation that they're in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, the remaining part of the interview, Dominic, I think we covered our book and your book.
Let me just talk about my book very quickly. It's
okay.
Not on, I haven't got a publishing deal in the United States yet. I'm hoping to get one. So you can only buy it. You can buy it through Amazon, but you can buy the Kindle version, but the physical version is a bit more problematic. I think you have to buy it through Amazon.co.uk and then get it shipped, which is a bit. So I would go for the Kindle version rather than the physical version. Yeah,
and I also got mine on Audible. So for our listeners who don't have as much time, I think that was great of you to put it on Audible, an audiobook, and I learn more efficiently that way.
Yeah, you can buy the audiobook. Also, lifeafterthestate.com. I've put it up there. You can buy it there with PayPal as well.
Now, with the remaining part of our time, Dominic, let's talk about gold and Bitcoin.
Yeah.
You're working on a Bitcoin book now.
Yeah. Nearly finished.
Okay, great. Do you think, though, that Bitcoin is similar to precious metals? Do you think Bitcoin will eventually turn into a currency and money, or do you agree with the IRS's definition of Bitcoin, how it's just a piece of property and every single transaction then should be accounted for and taxed?
Oh, blimey. I mean, if you tax every single transaction, that's very onerous.
Oh, yeah, that's going to be a lot of fun.
I mean, it all hinges on definition, really. I mean, how you define money. But, I mean, it was the guy who designed it deliberately tried to replicate gold in digital form. So he tried to replicate, he made sure that Bitcoin had a cost of production to it, and he made sure that supply was finite and limited so that, effectively it's a deflationary form of currency rather than an inflationary form of currency. And I mean, it is one way to think of it is as digital gold, and in some ways, it's actually better than gold. My stepdad was South African, and well, his parents were Jewish. Well, he's Jewish, and his parents were Jewish, and they fled Eastern Europe in the 1930s. And the way they were able to get out was with gold. They had some gold, and they were able to bribe their way out. And they wanted to get as far away from Europe as possible, so they came to South Africa. And then in the 1970s, my stepdad wanted to escape South Africa for his own reasons. But they had capital controls in those days, so you couldn't take your money out. And so he left South Africa with 60 Krugerrands on his person, came to London and started a new life in London. And those 60 Krugerrands were how he got started in his new life in London. So, but in taking those Krugerrands out, he took considerable risk. He could have been arrested. He could have had them confiscated or stolen.
They didn't have as many metal detectors back then, right? They didn't have these full body scanners.
I don't imagine, no. But with Bitcoin, he could have just sent them. You just clicked a button and the wealth was transferred. So in that respect, Bitcoin is actually better than gold. But it's you will never ever hold a Bitcoin on your person unless you buy one of those weird physical ones, and it's kind of not really the point. It only exists in the virtual world, in the computational world. I mean, it's the more I've written, I kind of started writing about Bitcoin a little bit cynically, really, but the more I've written about it, the more fantastic I think it is. And it's going to it has the potential to do to money something akin to what email did to the post, or what the internet did to newspapers. It's not going to kill banking, but it's going to change it.
It's going to lower the cost. It's going to force them to be more efficient, right?
The amount of cost, the money it saves. Goldman Sachs did a piece on that. At the moment, it compared to normal means of transferring money, Western Union and things like that, Bitcoin offers more than 90% savings, and that's when you use a Bitcoin service provider. If you don't use one, it's 100% savings compared to Western Union. Western Union charge about 10%.
Well, yeah, Western Union and MoneyGram and those guys look like an interesting short play as Bitcoin becomes adopted. But Bitcoin, one of the things about Bitcoin, I don't know if Bitcoin will ever be fully money, because obviously, like, money has to be a store of value, and who knows if Bitcoin's total supply, if someone doesn't try to hack it or something like that. I know all the cryptography and the code. What really impresses me is the technology itself.
Yeah.
I think it's usable in a lot of other things on the internet, and I think it's very impressive.
Yeah.
And that's what really impresses me the most about Bitcoin. So I don't know if Bitcoin's going to be the surviving virtual currency 10 or 15 years from now, but I know the technology is going to live on, because I listen to these tech entrepreneurs like Mark Andreessen, and these guys have been in tech their whole lives, and they're computer programmers, and they're just impressed with the Byzantine general problem that's been solved, and some of the other things that Bitcoin has been solved. So I view Bitcoin, Dominic, I don't know what you view it as, but I view it as a nice complement to gold and silver.
Yeah.
So it would be nice eventually, though, if we get to the point where maybe there's another virtual currency and gold or silver are backing it in a vault, and then people can just move the virtual currency that way as a receipt.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of like e-gold was. I mean, they've tried that. Gold Money tried it as well, but they gave up because the compliance was so onerous. But, I mean, I guess somebody's going to try that again. The problem with that is there's companies that do it and then they get done for money laundering.
Yeah, when the large U.S. banks are knowingly money laundering, drug cartel money and all these other, it's total hypocrisy.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, that's the problem.
So, do you expect then a lot of more mainstream businesses to accept Bitcoin? You're out of London. Are a lot of mainstream businesses in England taking Bitcoin already?
No, not really. I mean, more and more businesses are taking it on all the time, but you get the odd pub or something. Then, I mean, we're accepting Bitcoin as payment for the book, but I understand the guy, eBay, the head of eBay, I don't know what his name is, was doing a talk a day or two ago, and he said that eBay are actively looking at accepting Bitcoins and introducing Bitcoin into the software. I mean, that'll be a big step forward when that happens.
Yeah, and I've listened to the Overstock CEO, Patrick Byrne, talk about it, and he's gotten a lot of business by accepting Bitcoin by being the first major online retailer. So he thinks that Amazon and Netflix and those guys will eventually adopt it because Overstock is starting to take some of their market share, and he thinks that they will have no choice.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that. This story amuses me is that, the guy who invented it, Satoshi Nakamoto. By the way, in my book, I'm pretty sure I've cracked who Satoshi is. I'm not going to reveal it, but if you want to order a copy of the book, you can find out.
It's not Dorian, is it?
No, he's even less likely to have designed it than me. But I mean, that was just a joke. That, God, talk about lazy journalism. But so it's regarded by techies as such a monumental technological advancement because he cracked so many different technological problems that they actually wanted to have before Satoshi, and in the same way that you have before Christ and after Christ, they were going to have before Satoshi and after Satoshi, and it was going to be, but then it would have had to have been called BS before Satoshi, so the idea never really took off.
That's funny. Now, let's talk about gold here in the remaining last couple of minutes of the interview. The gold price has been through a very painful cyclical bear market. We can argue all day about how much of it is manipulation, how much of it's not. When I look at the supply-demand fundamentals, though, I look at Kuz-Jansen's numbers and how much physical gold China's gobbling up. I look at how much the ETF outflows is from GLD. Do you think we're eventually going to get back to reality here where the gold market trades on supply and demand, or do you think the price is going to stay flat and sideways for a while still?
I'm going to say I don't know. I mean, my opinion on that changes all the time, but I'll come to the China argument in a moment, but my prediction at the beginning of the year for the gold price was, I think, a low of 1050, but if we don't see 1050 before June or July, I don't think we'll see it. I think 1180 will remain the low. I mean, it's so flat at 1300 and the volumes are so low. I don't think I've ever seen volumes this low. So, often the longer it goes sideways, the bigger the move, the bigger the base and the bigger the eventual move will be. But, I doubt we'll go past 1500 this year. We might maybe get to 1450 or 1475 if we get a bit of a good run later in the year. But I'm not wildly optimistic about gold at the moment. I mean, I've still got loads of it, but I do think its time will come. I do think all this quantitative easing and all the rest of it that's gone on is bound to catch up sometime or other. The problem is there are such strong deflationary pressures in the form of increased productivity because, technology is just so, saving so many costs left, right and centre that all the money that's been printed hasn't been manifesting itself as inflation. But, I mean, there's some kind of monetary problems around the corner, at which point gold will get going again. The Chinese buying argument, people talk about the Chinese love gold and they're buying all this gold, but China's, I think as the Chinese get more and more advanced, they're going to be less and less interested in gold, funnily enough, because they're going to start using digital currency of one form or another.
But hasn't the Chinese government already banned Bitcoin? Yeah,
I mean, not necessarily Bitcoin. I mean, when I talk about digital money, I mean, online banking, the same way that you send and receive dollars. Most of the Chinese don't yet have access to that, but it's coming. And when they do, will they care about gold as much?
Well, you said that there's not a lot of inflation here. Well, there is inflation in the developed world in the U.S. and some in Europe in food prices and energy price. Your energy prices are probably very high compared to the U.S.
It's been high for ages. I mean, actually, crude. If you measure crude in pounds, the pound's been strong against the dollar over the last 2 or 3 years. Crude's the same price it was 3 years ago. I mean, the price at the pump's rather different. The price at the pump never goes down, but the actual price of a barrel is flat.
I see. Well, a lot of the inflation, if you read Jim Rickards' Currency Wars book, has been exported. So almost all.
And the one thing where there's a great deal of inflation is in the cost of government. That's one price that's going up all the time.
Well, yeah, they don't even have to set a budget here in the U.S. They don't even have to set a budget, and any time that anyone wants to argue over the increase in spending, so we're not even really cutting here in the U.S. The Paul Ryan plan, which Obama and Nancy Pelosi and all the other progressives call draconian, and he's going to kill poor people and grandmothers, it was just a decrease in the increasing spending rate, the Paul Ryan plan. So it wasn't a real cut.
Yeah. Our government in the UK has been on an austerity drive, and they've been trumpeting austerity. But the additions that they will make to the national debt in this term are more than the combined total of all the past governments of the last 100 years. In one term,
that's mind-boggling, and you could say the same thing about Japan.
Probably.
Yeah, you could basically probably say the same thing about Japan. So the developed world, Dominic, is almost all in the same boat, except the U.S. has the world reserve currency, unlike the other developed world countries. So the U.S. appears to be better, and we do have more entrepreneurs, I would say, here in the U.S. still, although I think I agree with you. I think the U.S. is heading down that path towards what England was, or towards what England is now, where there's just so many rules and regulations. I mean, besides internet entrepreneurship here in the U.S., where there's not a lot of rules and regulations, almost every other industry is not ripe for entrepreneurship here in the U.S. because you have to get very expensive permits, and there's humongous barriers of entry, and for some things you're looking at 10 or 20 years of government approvals and licenses and fees and things like this.
Yeah. Well, big government is very expensive. But I don't know when. I mean, there's going to be some, crap that hits the fan at some stage, and when it does, gold's bound to have a role to play. And I'm hoping that it'll be one of those moves that's so quick you almost won't have time to buy it. But I don't think we're quite there yet. I mean, the reality is, much as we may hate it, but they've actually got away with it.
And that's a good point. Yeah, I think really since 2011, it just appears to me that there's been even more manipulation in the gold price, and then I don't know, maybe the U.S. and China did a deal that we don't even know about, where China agreed to keep propping up the dollar and the U.S. Treasury market in 2011 when the gold price spiked, and they both lowered the paper price of gold so Wall Street could help ship more gold from the ETFs and other gold to China so China could get more gold and continue to prop up the dollar. I mean, maybe in 10 years with declassified government documents we'll find this out if this actually happened, but I don't know. From the tape action, it just seems like China has imported so much gold lately. They imported 100% of annual mine supply in 2013, and the price went down.
And they don't export any of the gold they produce, and they're the world's largest producer.
Exactly. Exactly.
The price of gold isn't determined by physical buying. It's determined by what goes on in the paper markets.
And I think that's the problem, because the paper markets aren't backed by anything.
Well, they are.
Well,
they are. But, I mean, most people buy and sell the paper. They never take delivery.
Yeah, and, well, eventually, I think, you mentioned the volume of the exchanges like COMEX and LBMA, how it's low. And I think one of that is a symptom that the people who actually want the metal are leaving those exchanges, and they're either buying physical from places like the U.S. Mint, or they're going to Asia and they're going to a physical exchange in Asia and taking delivery there and putting their metal in vaults outside of England or Europe or the United States.
Yeah. Well, we'll see.
Well, I just want to thank you very much for your time here, and tell our listeners where they can find your podcasts and your books.
Okay, well, you can find my podcast, just frisbeesbullsandbears.com. Actually, there's quite an interesting interview with Dimitri Speck about gold price manipulation on there that I did a while ago. But I've been so busy with the book, I haven't really updated, I haven't done any podcasts recently. But if you want to find out more about the book, the Bitcoin book, you can order your copy at, if you just type in Frisby Unbound Bitcoin or Frisby Bitcoin, you'll come to it. And you can order a digital copy at Bitcoin and hopefully be there from the publisher. And hopefully we'll have the book out in a month or so. And I'm hoping it'll be the first big mainstream book about Bitcoin. There's a bit of an arms race going on at the moment in that regard.
Yeah, you may be the first to publish a mainstream book on Bitcoin. I haven't seen one yet. I'm very surprised.
By the way, you get your name in the back. How about that for incentive?
Okay. Well, that sounds good to me. And thank you again for your time, Dominic. And when the Bitcoin book is fully out and you're ready to talk about it and I've read it, we'll have you back on.
I'll be glad to. Thanks very much, Jason.
Okay, great.